If you're a tutor and you want to know how to improve your practice, you've come to the right place. As someone who has tutored English for about 7 years, I've made a truckload of mistakes along the way. But rest assured, you don't need to make these mistakes, because here are 5 things that I wish that I had done at the start of my tutoring practice. As a young and naive English tutor, I cannot count on one hand the amount of hours that I would spend on the lead up to a single lesson, preparing the content that I would want to use. Since English is a subject that is less formulaic than other subjects, and more subjective for that matter, it's difficult to quantify the amount of time that should be spent creating your own content. This can all be solved by a strategy that we know as batch tasking. Fundamentally, the main objective of batch tasking is to avoid context switching, which lay terms the mental jump back and forth between tasks. When we tap 2 different apps on our phone and we switch between them, that is similar to what happens to our brain when we context switch. But since we aren't devices, it actually takes mental exertion and time to switch between tasks, which we don't want to spend too much of since we have a very finite amount of both. To prevent too much context switching, I make sure to plan all of my lessons in a single sitting wherever possible. And then when I plan the rest of the content for the week, the same thing applies, and I'll try and complete them in as little sittings as possible. I'll only allocate a certain amount of time to each year level, and if I surpass that, I'll try to either draw upon previous work or use work from a textbook. Now, if you have a stigma against textbook work, keep watching and I'll address that in my next tip.
Thank you.
So back to batch tasks. My personal recommendation is that you time the amount of minutes or hours that you spend creating content per year level per week. If you do this, you'll be able to see where you spend the most time and where you spend the least. And from gathering this data, you'll be able to discern how much time you need to spend on your tutoring as a whole. As a self-proclaimed purist, I used to believe that all of the content I set students should be homemade only. This is because I had heard so many horror stories of students who hated learning, all because they were set worksheets that were monotonous, dull, and didn't match their skill level at all.
I hate it. I just hate it.
But I slowly came to realize that tutoring is like a balanced diet. Hear me out here. No matter what type of content you create, you will be biased towards a certain direction of study, particularly if it's a more subjective subject such as English. For example, I'm definitely biased towards a certain type of novel studies. Not only that, I'm also prone to focusing on specific aspects of the text, whereas someone else could look at the same text and have a different perspective entirely and want to draw out different things. Now, I'm not saying that a novel study is bad, but if it's the only component that's focused on, it can mean that they miss out on some of the other nutrients that they need to make them more well-rounded and adaptable learners. Because English doesn't just include reading comprehension, it also includes things that we know such as analysis, vocabulary, creative writing, just to name a few. So, avoid creating academic tunnel vision in your students by exposing them to a wide variety of texts, authors, and resources. In this way, you'll be providing them with a nutritious diet, which not only includes depth, but width as well. Something that I've picked up throughout my teaching degree is the importance of reflection, and it's much easier than you might think. According to Firestone, reflective teaching is when you think over what has happened during the lesson. They'll analyze how something was taught and how it could be improved for a greater learning outcome. And there's plenty of research that suggests that reflective practice is actually indicative of an exemplary teaching practice. Duchesne and Mick Moore recommend using a reflective journal or a portfolio to document every stage of the teaching process and then evaluate it consequently. However, I like to use a much simpler approach just because that's what's sustainable for me and that's what ensures that I keep reflecting.
I've attached a sample table here to show you what this might look like. It has a slightly different format than what I would usually use, just so I can fit it better into this frame that you're seeing, but it's essentially very similar. As you can see, I've tried to note down 2 things that went well in the lesson, as well as 2 things to improve for next time. Even though it sounds quite simple, it ensures that I try to look at myself as well as the lesson with a more objective lens. I've also included a category to write down things that I learnt. I use it as a broad category to add extra notes, as well as categories for all completed tasks, set homework for the week, and any work that's recommended for the next week. I found the set homework category to be useful in ensuring that the work of students never goes unnoticed, while the recommended work for the next week provides guidance to my future self on the day where I need to create the lesson plan for the upcoming week. But if this seems too simplistic for you, Duchess and Mickmore provide some great sample questions in their textbook to provoke thought and guide reflection, which you can pause to look at now if you want.
I hope that you can use reflective practice because it's not just useful within the teaching sphere, but in every aspect of your life. If you constantly evaluate your strengths and weaknesses as an individual and act upon them accordingly, you'll realize that reflection is a habit that can tremendously change your life for the better. If you've ever been a student, you would know that your enjoyment of a subject would often hinge on your relationship with the teacher. According to Zhao, a positive relationship between educator and student would often result in more favourable outcomes for the student in terms of academic performance. Zhao even went as far to suggest that pre-service teachers should be taught how to create welcoming and amiable relationships with students. One method of achieving this is through a method that I learned from a respected teacher I know. This is what I like to call the palm card method. It's really simple, it really shouldn't be called a method, but it's where you get different palm cards for different students. So each palm card will be dedicated to a different student and you'll write their general details down. So for example, if you had Rob and Tina in your class, you'll write them both down on different palm cards. The palm card method comes in handy here and ensures that you have some conversation grounds for disengaged learners especially. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, gee, this isn't a classroom, this is tutoring, and I only tutor one student at a time. I'm pretty sure I can pay adequate attention to them. And you might be right, but because you only have one student, that makes building rapport with them all the more important, especially if you're aiming for the long term.
I pay attention. I pay attention.
If you use the palm card method, you can write down important details of their lives, such as their birthdays, their cultural background, their hobbies, and even aspects of the subject that you teach that they enjoy. By using this method, you'll be able to connect the content that you teach to their personal lives, and by doing so, not only can you build engagement and rapport with the learner, but you can also help them to feel heard. As a tutor, I believe that is one of the most important things we can do because you're meeting them once a week, and I believe that you're having a sizable influence upon their life. I only wish I had implemented this method sooner so that I could watch my students grow in their development of new interests and as an individual. According to TimeTap, a cancellation policy is simply a written agreement between the service provider and the client outlining the consequences, typically a fee, of when the client or the service provider choose to cancel their appointment. If you're a tutor, cancellation policies may be your best friend. What am I getting at here? A cancellation policy essentially assures that there's accountability between you and the guardian.
Well, I'll cancel it.
No, don't cancel it.
Imagine that you had spent a sizable amount of time waiting for your student to show up, only for them to never come. I don't know about you, but I would feel at least very frustrated, if not embarrassed. A cancellation policy is the solution to this. So even if your student didn't arrive, they would still have to pay for a portion of the lesson fee, as stated in the written agreement of the cancellation policy. Similarly, if you had failed to show up, it might be only fair for you to pay that fee to the parents. I only thought of using such a policy after I was fed up with students either cancelling at the last minute or not showing up entirely, but I really wish I enacted this sooner. Now, I scarcely have last minute cancellations, and if lessons do get cancelled, it's usually with a few days notice at least. I can count on seeing my students week in, week out without a hitch. One thing I will say though is that discernment should be exercised when you enact this policy. For example, if one of your students is violently sick a few hours before the lesson is supposed to begin, it's up to you to decide whether you want to enact that cancellation policy or not, in order to maintain goodwill between you and the client. Goodwill can ensure that in the long term, you and your client enjoy a good relationship. If you want to make your own cancellation policy, I would recommend looking up the cancellation policies of several organisations and compiling them, depending on what you think is best in each. I personally think that the cancellation policy provided on Alchemy Tuition's website is superb, and I've subsequently linked it down below under useful links if you want to take a look. This brings us to the end of 5 things that I wish I did when I started tutoring. If you found this video useful in any way, please like the video and subscribe for more study and tutoring tips.